Yeah, so yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for coming today. I'm Bertin Ortega and I'm organizer of this workshop with Aranz Pelayo. I am a UIC philosophy graduate student, and this is the second workshop on epistemic diversity. The title of this workshop is Collaborating and Strategizing as a Minority. This workshop will be different, slightly different, because we will have a speaker and a group of panelists who will talk about their experiences in collaborating as a minority. And today's speaker is Hannah Rubin. She's a philosophy professor at the University of Notre Dame. Her area of specialization is philosophy of biology, game and decision theory, and philosophy of science. She was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen. She was mentored in the Job Candidate Mentoring Program for Women in Philosophy. She has a forthcoming paper called Reintroducing Kin Selection to the Human Behavioral Sciences in Philosophy of Science Journal. Today, she will give us a talk promoting diverse collaborations, and she will discuss potential causes and consequences of lack of diverse collaborations, as well as some potential pitfalls of policies aims to improve it. Before our speaker starts with her presentation, I want to let you know that I will moderate this discussion. In the chat, you could leave your questions and I will read them. So our speaker will answer them at the end of the talk. So please join me in welcoming her. So thank you, Professor Rubin, for coming today.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this, looks like, great series of workshops. So let me share my screen. Okay. And let me also apologize if I sort of have to stop and collect my thoughts somewhere in the middle of the talk. I've been having migraines for the past month or so, which isn't ideal for giving a talk, but I think it'll be fine. So let me get my notes set up, and you can see my slides still. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to talk about some work, mostly arising from a couple of papers on issues of discrimination and collaboration. So these papers are concerning the social nature of epistemic communities and looking at the norms governing interactions in these communities and their effects on productive inquiry. So my colleagues and I started looking into these issues in part because we were motivated by a set of empirical results. So one, it's been shown that in many fields, women are less likely to have prestigious first and last author positions in collaborative work. And two, in some fields, women and people of color are more likely to collaborate with in-group members. That is, they mostly collaborate with people in their own same social identity group. So what I'm going to do today is suggest that there's a causal link between these two observations, that this is relevant to how we think about the epistemic benefits of diversity, and it's relevant to how we go about trying to promote diversity. So just to relate this to the themes of the workshop, here's what you can expect in terms of the what's, hows, and whys of diversifying cognitively. So I'll say a bit about the what's, but I won't really focus on that part. I'll say more about the whys, and specifically, I'll talk about why we need what I'll refer to as effective diversity. That is, not just diversity that focuses on numbers of different types of people within a field, but genuine exchange of ideas between different types of people. So I'll also talk about the hows, but unfortunately, mostly in the context of how not to try to go about it. That is, I'll talk about some reasons why we lack diversity and how attempts to rectify this may actually have negative unintended consequences. Okay, so here's a roadmap for the talk. First, I'll describe the methodology that I'm going to use and give some setup for understanding how I'm going to argue for these conclusions. Then I'll talk a little bit about a paper where Kaylin O'Connor and I look at how discriminatory behavior and collaborative behavior interact in epistemic communities. Then I'll spend some time discussing a follow-up paper that Kaylin and I worked on with Mike Schneider, where we used the same framework to discuss the potential efficacy of various types of initiatives aimed at improving the diversity of collaborative groups. And in particular, we suggest that there's a tension between social and epistemic goods. Certain proposals may successfully increase diversity and collaborations, furthering the epistemic goals of the community, but at the cost of introducing further inequity. Okay, so first the methodology. It is notoriously difficult to generate empirical data testing historical or current causes of cultural norms. So in order to explore causal dependencies that we can't get access to in the real world, we instead employ game theoretic models, which are designed to represent strategic interactions between agents. So we can't go back in time to figure out what happened in real epistemic communities. We can't observe the thousands of little interactions in current communities that generate norms, conventions, or other behavioral patterns. So this is a way to gain traction on this problem, even where it defies empirical observation. So in particular, in both of these papers, we consider agent-based models of actors playing the Nash demand game on a network. So first I'll describe the Nash demand game, and then I'll tell you about the networks. The Nash demand game, which is also sometimes called divide the cake or divide the pie, is a representation of bargaining. In the Nash demand game, two actors must choose how to divide a resource by demanding portions of the resource. If these demands exceed the total amount of resource, bargaining breaks down and no one gets anything. So for example, we both can't get more than half of a resource, and if we both really think we deserve that much, we're not going to get anywhere in bargaining. So we look at a version of this game where there's three possible demands. You can make a medium demand and demand exactly half the resource. You can make a high demand and demand more, or you can make a low demand and demand less. To make things easier to follow, I've assigned some particular values to the demands here. So the total resource is assumed to have value of 10, and then agents can demand 40, 50, or 60% of this resource. The table here summarizes the outcomes of the game in terms of payoffs or utility given each of the player's demands. Here's how you go about reading it. The rows represent strategies available to player one, so demanding low, medium, or high, and then the columns represent player two's strategies, low, medium, or high. To figure out the payoffs for each player, we look at the cells of the table corresponding to a combination of strategies. So for example, if player one demands medium and player two also demands medium, they both get a payoff of 5. If player one demands high and player two demands low, player one gets a payoff of 6, while player two gets a payoff of 4. But if player one demands high and player two demands medium, bargaining breaks down and they both receive a payoff of 0. There are 3 what are called Nash equilibria in this game, cases where no actor wants to change their strategy. So first, there's an equilibrium where both demand exactly half. No one wants to demand more because if they do, bargaining will break down, and no one wants to demand less because then they're just getting less. There's also 2 equilibria where one actor demands the high amount and the other demands the low amount. Again, the actors are perfectly splitting the resource, so no one wants to demand any more or less. People generally say that the equilibrium where the players get the same payoff is fair, and the ones where they get different payoffs are unfair. Okay, so I started out talking about collaboration and discrimination, and then I moved really quickly into talking about this bargaining game. And you might rightly be wondering how these 2 things are related. Well, there's a natural interpretation of this game as representing academic collaboration and division of credit. So under the academic interpretation, collaborators produce some resource, publishable research, for instance, which exceeds what they could produce independently. But then they must bargain sometimes or often implicitly, to determine first, who does what research and how much, and second, who gets credit in the form of author order. So the best way to interpret strategies in this case is as representing a demand for author position relative to amount of work done. So if I do the bulk of work on a paper and I demand first author position, I'm making a medium demand. This means that the medium outcome, Nash equilibrium, could be in a sense unequal, but it's still equitable. And so then what we're worried about is the emergence of inequity, not inequality. We're worried about arriving at one of those two inequitable outcomes. So the agents playing this game in our models are of two cultural or social identity groups. This could represent different genders or different racial groups, or really any aspect of social identity that people take to be relevant to their interactions. And when we observe patterns of behavior where one side consistently makes a high demand and the other low, for example, if men are consistently demanding more out of their female collaborative partners, we can use this as a representation of discrimination between groups. So this is obviously a very thin representation of real-world norms, but it captures important features of discriminatory norms where there's inequity and it's based on social identity. Okay, so just to mention some context for the results of the papers I'll discuss. Others have shown that discriminatory norms of the sort we're interested in can emerge on networks of agents. However, these authors didn't consider the possible effects of minority status on the emergence of these norms. On the other hand, previous results by Justin Brunner and my co-author Kaylin show that a minority group can be disadvantaged and that they're more likely to be discriminated against in this bargaining context. This disadvantage to the minority is due to what's called the Red King effect, where the slower runner wins the race. And here's the basic reasoning that many mathematical models have demonstrated. Minority groups learn how to interact with the majority quickly. There are a lot of people in the majority, so they run into them often and they have more opportunities to learn how to behave towards them compared to the majority group who doesn't really run into the minority that often. And in many bargaining situations, demanding a lower amount is your best option when you don't know what your bargaining partner is going to do. You don't want to demand too much and risk bargaining falling apart, so it's best to play it safe and be accommodating. So initially, both groups learn this fact, tending towards lower demands, but the minority learns it much faster. But then once the minority is demanding less, the majority can learn to take advantage of that and get more out of the bargains. So the minority quickly learns to make low demands, and then the majority slowly learns to take advantage, leading to a discriminatory norm. So these results on the Red King effect have been showed in a variety of contexts. However, these previous results are for models where agents interact at random in a population, and random interactions really isn't how most interactions in an epistemic community go. Instead, to summarize how people are connected to and interact with each other within a group or community, it's common to represent that community using a network. So in our case, we have nodes of the networks, which represent academics. We then have edges or links of the network between the nodes, representing collaborative endeavors. So the setup will allow us to talk about the emergence of discrimination in a model that captures features of real-world epistemic communities. It also allows us to investigate what happens to patterns of collaboration, because people can change who they're connected to based on how their collaborations are going. So also, because there are two different social identity groups, I'll be talking about within group links involving two members of the same social identity, and between group links involving members of two different social identity groups. So the bargaining part of these models is tracking discrimination, and the network part is tracking collaboration. Okay, so first we look at discrimination in this context of viewing academics as part of a network within their community. We argue that discrimination can arise in these epistemic communities even without individual agents exhibiting any bias, that minority groups are more likely to be discriminated against, and that this discrimination can decrease the effective diversity of these communities. So I'll describe the sense in which there's no bias in a minute, but note this is not an argument that bias doesn't exist. I wouldn't want to deny that, certainly it does. This is, however, an argument that even in the absence of biases, minority groups can be disadvantaged based on their minority status alone. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how we reach these conclusions. As I mentioned, we used agent-based models to capture the dynamics of how people in research communities interact with each other. As will be clear, we use models of interactions which are highly idealized. As such, they're not meant to capture specifics of any real population, but instead to illuminate certain causal relationships. So for instance, these models aren't going to capture things like one group having more power, which is certainly something that's important in real populations and can definitely affect bargaining outcomes. However, ignoring these many various features allows us to get away from these messy details and to focus in on the relationship we're interested in investigating. So for instance, the relationship between discrimination and effective diversity. So I'll go through the models and results pretty quickly. I'm going to leave out a bunch of details so that I have time to focus on more big picture questions about the implications of discrimination and lack of effective diversity. But of course, feel free to ask me any questions about the model in the Q&A. So I do, though, want to point out some important features of the model. And to do this, I'll talk about first 3 important assumptions that we make to talk about bargaining evolution in the model. So first, we can say that our agents don't exhibit any bias in the sense that the bargaining strategies they start out with are initially randomly assigned. That is, the agents have no preconceived notion of the minority group deserving any less, either implicitly or explicitly. They're equally likely to demand high, medium, or low against someone from their own social identity group or someone from a different group. Second, the agents in our model are utility maximizers, and in particular, they care about the credit received from their collaborations, and they make decisions to try to maximize the amount of credit they receive per amount of work that they put in. So they're going to choose their strategies according to what's called the best response dynamics, where basically they're going to look at what all their collaborators are demanding, and they're going to pick the strategy that gets them the highest payoff given what their collaborators are doing. So third, the agents use type conditioning when choosing their bargaining strategy. Agents have one strategy for in-group interactions and one strategy for between-group interactions. While type conditioning may conjure up images of discrimination, the two are not the same thing. There are many cases where type conditioning is necessary for a group to function well, and many cases where it's ethically unproblematic. For instance, it's arguably a good thing to make a distinction between elderly and young bus passengers and to treat them differently by giving your seat to one type but not the other. Okay, so the results I'm going to discuss depend on these last 2 features. And of course, neither is completely true of real people, but there is evidence that people do tend to make decisions based on the credit they receive, and they do tend to treat people of the same type in the same way, even if they do so subconsciously. So as long as people have these tendencies, even if they don't behave like this 100% of the time, we can take our models to tell us something about how interactions in these epistemic communities can lead to discrimination. So that's how we think about bargaining and the possible emergence of discriminatory norms. As I mentioned, though, we also look at the evolution of the collaboration network. And we do so using this procedure that comes from Allison Watts, where agents choose to break and reform collaborative links. In this model, agents have a maximum number of collaborations because no one has unlimited time to work on as many projects as they want. And so agents can break lower payoff links in order to form higher payoff links. Importantly, both collaborators must agree to form a new link, but an agent can unilaterally decide to sever an old link. So we start with an empty network where there's no links between any of the nodes, and at each time step, 2 nodes are chosen at random. One of these is an agent who will update their links, and the other is either a potential or a current collaborator of that agent. Abstracting a bit from the details, a link's going to be formed whenever it benefits both agents, and links will be broken whenever one of those agents can find a better partner to link with, someone that gets them a higher payoff. So putting these two parts together, we're going to start with an empty network and a random distribution of strategies and let the agents update both their bargaining strategies and their collaborative partners. And just to give a big picture of what this model represents, imagine a community of researchers, some men, some women. They have regular collaborative partners with whom they divide labor and credit. Sometimes they realize that their collaborative strategies aren't working because, for example, they're too aggressive about credit, or maybe they're doing too much of the work. And they try something that will be more successful given what their partners are doing. Sometimes they encounter a new collaborative partner who's less demanding and decide to drop an older working partner. So here's basically the results of the model. Within each social identity group, a very, very likely outcome is the fair or equitable norm, everyone demanding the medium amount against those who share their same social identity. Between groups, though, these networks tend not to reach a single norm, but instead have sub-pockets of fair and discriminatory behavior between the groups, where the majority group members are more likely to discriminate, demanding more when they're interacting with the minority. In general, the fair links between groups are maintained and the discriminatory ones are broken. And at the end, we're left with a partially segregated network. Okay, so let's look at a couple specific results in more detail. The one thing we were interested in was whether discrimination varies with the minority group size. So we determined this by looking at the proportion of majority group members that demanded the high amount when interacting with the minority. And we found that the minority is more likely to be discriminated against the smaller it is. That is, we found in this context, we observed something similar to the Red King effect, where minorities are more often discriminated against. And just like previous results on the Red King effect, the smaller the minority, the worse it is. We were also interested in, as I mentioned, the effective diversity of the network, whether there was less across-group collaboration than would be expected if one were to simply look at the number of minority group members. So to measure how segregated these networks were, we measured what's called homophily, which is the tendency of individuals to associate with members of their own social identity group. And so we asked, does this discrimination affect homophily? And we found that the more the majority discriminates, the more homophilic the network is. This is because as the majority group discriminated more often, more of the minority group members would break links with them in favor of links within the minority group, where there were generally fair bargaining outcomes. Just to give a picture of what these sort of outcomes look like, here are a couple of the collaboration networks from our paper. The orangish dots are members of the minority group, and the blue dots are majority group members. The network on the left represents a case where not too many majority group members, roughly 22%, demand the high amount. And you can see that in this case, there's some homophily. Some of the little orange circles are a bit clustered together, mostly collaborating among themselves, but not as much as in the graph on the right, where roughly 45% of the majority group discriminates and fewer of the minority group members are collaborating with the majority. So the takeaway from this is that when bargaining and collaboration co-evolve, we expect majority discrimination and as a result, homophily. So this suggests a connection between those two observations I started the talk with, that minority group members receive less credit in collaborations and that they tend to collaborate within their social identity group. So one thing we were interested in then was looking at the various ways one might try to address this lack of effective diversity. So first, to further motivate this question, I'll argue that effective diversity, or having diverse collaborations, matters above and beyond just having diverse members in a community. Then I'll discuss some diversity initiatives one might think of implementing in order to address the lack of effective diversity. I'll argue that these might have unintended negative consequences, but that it's important to implement some sort of initiative in order to avoid what we call a contagion of disrespect for subfields practiced by minority groups. So why does effective diversity matter over and above diversity of the community? That is, so long as diverse ideas are present somewhere in the community, why should it matter whether collaborations happen between groups or not? So for example, suppose a researcher from one social identity group is likely to figure out A, and a researcher from another group B. If they collaborate, they might also together conclude C, which follows from A and B. However, you might think the community has another route to knowing C. A and B are published separately. The community as a whole has access to these ideas and then concludes C for themselves. So there's a few reasons why we think diversity within collaborations might be important. So first, it's possible that A and B independently aren't interesting enough to warrant publication, and that they're only valuable realizations insofar as they jointly imply C. In this case, it's reasonable to think that A and B would never be published on their own, and thus the community would never come to know C. Second, there's reason to think that the actual process of collaborating with those unlike ourselves might positively influence deliberation and discovery, in that important information is more likely to be considered and fewer errors are made. More specific to academia, there's also some limited evidence that work produced by diverse collaborative teams is of higher quality. And if you were at the workshop last month, I believe you heard a talk about a couple different ways demographic diversity can improve group performance in these contexts. Finally, even if collaborations with diverse authorship don't tend to be of higher quality, homophily alone can impede epistemic progress. Information spreads more slowly through homophilic networks, so a homophilic network will be less efficient in that it'll take longer for the community to reach various conclusions. Additionally, in certain cases, such homophilic networks can also prevent the spread of new and better scientific practices throughout the community as a whole. Okay, so I think we have reasons to care about having diverse research teams in addition to having diverse group membership if we care about our epistemic practices. Then we can ask the question, given that we know there's homophily in certain epistemic communities, what might one try to do to address this? So I'm not going to attempt a complete description of diversity initiatives, and the point here really isn't to make any specific policy recommendations. I'm only going to talk about a few cases where the modeling framework we're using can illuminate some possible overlooked consequences of certain types of initiatives. So first, a common sense suggestion is that we improve minority representation. In the modeling framework described, though, this wouldn't necessarily change existing patterns of bargaining. This is because new members of a group will be in an environment where those around them already tend to adhere to some norm, meaning that their best response will involve adhering to that same norm. If more minority group members are added to a network where the majority discriminates, they're likely to meet majority group members who demand high of them, meaning that low is their most successful response. These new members of the community will eventually learn to demand low of the majority and eventually learn to avoid collaborating with them, leading to perpetuation of homophily and non-diverse collaborations. Now, of course, this isn't to suggest that there aren't good reasons to promote the presence of underrepresented groups in epistemic communities. The point here is just that we shouldn't expect the simple addition of minority individuals to change inequitable patterns of behavior into equitable ones or to decrease collaborative homophily. We have to do something about it. Another suggestion might be that grant-giving agencies create special initiatives to promote diverse collaborations. And there are a few ways they might do this. Grant agencies might introduce initiatives to clear up the schedule of academics who are interested in engaging in a new collaborative project with a member of a different social identity group. This could involve, for example, a paid course release or special money to hire research assistants. And these interventions might be thought of as creating new possible links for academics above the maximum number that they previously had, but these new links can only be used for diverse collaborations. So as a result, we'd expect between group collaborations to increase under this sort of initiative. However, under this sort of initiative, academics will choose to collaborate between groups, even in cases where they're being discriminated against. After all, some amount of academic credit is better than none. And if there's patterns of discrimination in an academic community, then these between group links tend to involve someone being taken advantage of. So the gain in diversity within collaborations comes along with a loss in equity. Another type of initiative might increase the credit granted to certain collaborations. So this could be achieved by making it more likely that diverse teams will win grants, or by giving larger grant amounts to projects with diverse investigators, for instance. So people with some grants can publish more, generating more credit. I should say these categories of grants aren't meant to be clear-cut categories. This is just a way of thinking about how these sorts of grants might hope to decrease homophily of the network and the framework that we're providing. So if a grant can be seen as creating more credit rather than creating new between group links, it's less immediately clear what the effects might be, as researchers still have to choose whether to collaborate within or between groups with their set number of links. Therefore, we provide a model in order to evaluate the possible consequences of this sort of initiative. This model is almost exactly like the model of coevolution of bargaining and collaboration I just talked about, but now we're interested in the effects of changing the payoffs for between group collaboration under the idea that this might promote diverse collaborations. So in the Nash demand game that I presented before, actors are dividing a resource of size 10. Now we vary the size of the pie for between group collaborations by multiplying the total available payoff or credit by some amount, which is cleverly represented by the parameter pi. So if pi is 1.5, then between group collaborations, agents are dividing a resource of size 15 rather than 10. So agents can then demand 40, 50, or 60% of this, so they can demand 6, 7.5, or 9. And to summarize the results of letting the total amount of credit for between group collaboration vary, we find that the minority is still more likely to be discriminated against the smaller it is. In fact, the relationship between minority group size and majority discrimination is essentially unchanged by varying pi. Increasing pi does decrease homophily, thus increasing the effective diversity of the network, but there's a trade-off between diversity and equity, as I'll explain in a moment. So here's a graph of the results. We vary the payoff for between group collaboration on the x-axis from them being worth the same amount as within group collaborations to them being worth twice as much as within group collaborations. So the blue line tracks the proportion of discrimination as we vary pi. That is the proportion of between group collaborations in which a majority member is demanding high. As you can see, increasing incentives for between group collaboration leaves the proportion of collaborations that are discriminatory essentially unchanged. The purple line then tracks the instances of discrimination using the y-axis on the right, which is found by simply adding up the total number of collaborations in which a majority member discriminates against a minority group member. So these counted up instances of discrimination increase precipitously as pi increases. And this is because, as I mentioned, increasing the size of the pi decreases homophily. That is, it increases the total number of links that are formed between groups. So the majority group isn't demanding high more often, but the policy brings minorities into contact with existing discriminatory behavior. So there's further implications that come out of this when thinking about the long term after the initiative ends. If the initial lack of diverse collaborations is due to minority group members breaking links with majority group members to protect themselves from discrimination, then when the initiative ends, homophily will likely reappear. And in the meantime, the initiative has not only perpetuated, but further entrenched inequity. This is because even though both majority and minority group members' absolute payoffs are increased during the initiative because they get slices of a bigger overall pie, the difference between minority payoffs and majority payoffs increases because now minority group members are willing to enter into discriminatory collaborations, which give more of that pie to the majority group. So the initiative only temporarily fosters diversity, while the majority group accumulates more power, prestige, etc., by collaborating with the minority and receiving an undue amount of credit for those collaborations. So this has implications for a standard sort of argument that people give in favor of diversity initiatives, which we refer to as private sins as public goods arguments. The argumentative structure is this. Here are XYZ reasons why increasing diversity will promote various social goods. If these fail to convince, here are the purely epistemic benefits as well. So these are private sins as public goods arguments because they convince those only interested in epistemic gains to incidentally promote socially beneficial policies. So the arguments that I gave for the epistemic benefits of diverse collaborations that I gave earlier would count as such arguments. Unfortunately, if one really cares about social benefits, this argumentative strategy backfires in situations like this, where policies to promote epistemic goods and policies to promote social goods can come apart. So I recently found out that this sort of argument has also been called the business case for diversity. I wish that paper had been out when we were writing this paper, but so it goes. Now I have two names for those arguments. Okay, so one might worry that the epistemic benefits of diverse collaborations are insufficient to merit policies that entrench social inequity. Unfortunately, there may be further reason to think that homophily by itself will lead to a different sort of inequity, which perhaps diverse collaborative links might solve. That is, although we've argued that some initiatives to promote effective diversity carry negative social consequences, there's reasons to think that we need to do something because persistent lack of effective diversity can create new social and epistemic harms. Homophilic communities can come to champion different subdisciplines or niches. And the cases we're worried about are those where niches championed by the minority groups become low prestige by virtue of their association with marginalized researchers, while correspondingly niches championed by the majority group enjoy elevations of prestige. That is, lack of effective diversity can create the conditions for particular domains of study to become ghettoized by virtue of their associations with particular marginalized social groups. That is, they suffer a contagion of disrespect, where new results in those niches are increasingly dismissed as unimportant to the production of knowledge. So this is an effect that we don't necessarily know about good evidence for, but are conjecturing exists based on some historical examples. I realize I'm pretty much out of time, so I will just mention that the history of fields such as child study and home economics give us evidence to think that certain fields, by virtue of their association with marginalized groups, can become increasingly dismissed as irrelevant. And we think this should complicate our thinking about the potential benefits and pitfalls of initiatives to promote diversity. So thanks, and I look forward to hearing your questions and to the panel discussion. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, it's a great talk. Trying to summarize very many abstract things now. It was really great. So now is the moment for questions. Or I will read it, and our speaker can answer. So you could type the questions in the chat if you feel comfortable with that, and also you can raise your hand. Yeah, please, Dave.
Hi, thanks so much. That was really interesting. I was just curious about the part where you increase the credit for diverse collaborations. And I was I'm not doubting your result, but there's this intuitive argument that points in the other direction. I just wanted you to comment that because the potential minority collaborators are a scarce resource, you'd think that there'd be some dynamic where they could ask for more and actually get it. And I was just curious if you have a story about why that doesn't actually happen.
Yeah, so this is something that it's a good point. And so you might think that if people realize that there's this scarce resource, then these people that are now in high demand can actually demand more. So the reason that we don't get it in the model is that there's already existing discrimination and everyone has a sort of finite number of links anyway. And so they can get all of the links they want in the model, basically. And it's because the minority group members are also incentivized to accept basically whatever deal that they can get, that they're not going to try to demand more because it might actually fall apart for them. So does that make sense? So the idea is that there's a finite number of links and everyone is incentivized into accepting basically whatever deal they can get. And since there's pre-existing discrimination, the minority doesn't want to go against the grain and ruin this potential really like beneficial collaboration for themselves.
Yeah, so I see that. I didn't appreciate that feature of your model. Do you have any thoughts on whether you think that is a realistic feature of your model or not? This cap on the number, that it, and the cap is so low that everybody can get to it.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing to say is that we looked at these models with different like set number of caps on the links. So one thing we looked at was when the maximum number of links was 3, that's pretty low. That might be unrealistically low. We also looked at cases where the maximum number of links were 9. So that's 9 recurring collaborative projects with people. You might think, well, that's pretty good number of projects to be working on at any given time.
Just one last follow-up. With taking that cap into account, you might think that if the minority group was less small, that actually might give them more bargaining power. So because there's fewer people in the majority to collaborate with, so that would, anyway, I just.
So if the minority group were sort of maybe like 40% instead of 10%, you would think that that would give them more bargaining power, or
Yeah, so the idea is that if there are fewer people in the majority to collaborate with, they're not going to saturate unless they reach out to one of the minority group members. And then given the extra value for the diverse collaborations, that might change the result. That was the.
Yeah, be interesting.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Is the first one, do you know the name of the grants or the agencies that provide this type of funding? So maybe the question is related to if you have look up some actual agencies that do the kind of things that you're criticizing, or maybe.
So I don't actually know if people give, so I know there's grants that try to promote research that looks into how to promote diversity in scientific fields. I don't know if anyone has explicitly come out with a policy that we are going to give more funding to diverse collaborative teams. I think that a lot of sort of diversity policies that even if they're not explicitly coming out and saying that, they do sort of in effect make that kind of decision when it comes to funding. So no, I don't know of any specific grant agencies that come out and say this is our policy.
Yeah, thank you. Do Arinze, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I found it really interesting. And I was wondering whether, so I guess this is kind of disconnected to the Red King effect, but I am curious about cases in which you have somebody who is part of the minority group and ends up being, ends up, I guess, becoming part of the majority group in some sense, or being perceived as being part of the majority group. I'm wondering if if and how, I guess, the models you're dealing with could maybe account for something like that.
Yeah, so I guess the short answer is our models can't accommodate that. So in these sorts of cases, we're looking at these features of social identity are not supposed to be easily changeable, because otherwise, if you were getting discriminated against and you could change, that would seem, at least if you're only caring about utility maximization, that would seem like something you would do, and then the norm would just completely disappear. But I guess if you're thinking about historical cases where people's views on certain social identities and the way that we group people into certain social identity groups has changed over time, that'd be really interesting to look at how the norms of interaction shift as these cultural categories shift as well. So sorry, that's not quite an answer to your question. You'd have to kind of build a new model in which these social categories could, due to external forces, maybe shift over time.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question. I will read it. Given the effects of increasing equity when giving credit for cross-group collaborations, how may we increase diversity without increasing inequity? Will it be work only give credit for collaborations where the minority collaborator gets first author?
Sorry, could you say that last part again?
Yeah, so will it work to only give credit for collaborations where the minority collaborator gets first author? Like more credit?
Yeah, so there's a few things to say about that. So in terms of how we might go about promoting this effective diversity while not increasing inequity, I would think that what you'd have to do is supplement these efforts to promote diversity with efforts to be very clear about what the norms of collaboration are and how you divide up credit. The only problem with that is that even when there's norms of collaboration for how to determine author order, how to report, basically like what percent of work each person did, things like that, sometimes you can still get situations where even if the norms of collaboration, like who gets what author order, are very explicit, the community as a whole can still judge the contributions to the work in different ways. So for instance, in economics, women who co-author with men are less likely to get tenure because they get less credit for those collaborations with men. And the effect is much less pronounced when they are collaborating with women. They're both assumed to have contributed equally to the project. So there's a lot, I guess one of the points of the talk is that there's a lot of very complicated interactions between norms at different levels of the community. And so when we institute certain policies, we ought to be very careful to look at what are the possible negative consequences and also come out with a policy at the same time to try to mitigate those negative consequences.
Thank you. I think we have another, someone raised her hand, Hannah Martins.
Oh, Dr. Rubin sort of answered my question there at the end. I was thinking about asking how you might model something like the contagion effect, but like when you're co-collaborating, like is there some sort of misidentification of credit when you're collaborating with a minority, even if they're getting what like looks like more credit? So you kind of answered that question.
So thank you. So thank you again. So for your talk and your answers. So I think I think now it's time for a small break of 5 minutes. So we're coming back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems that we are done with our 5 minutes break. So now it's time to move to the second part of this workshop. We're happy to have three panelists who are at different stage in their academic careers. They're all very active in the UIC community. They will talk about their experiences of working as a minority. So we're going to have now like a concrete version of what Professor Rubin has discussed in an abstract form. They will answer questions such as have their educational background or personality characteristics put them at disadvantage when collaborating and trying to stick to the norms of a given field. So our three speakers are Aixa Alfonso, Shari Garrett, and Annette Martin. Aixa Alfonso is an associate professor of biological science at UIC. Shari Garrett is a PhD student from the microbiology and immunology department, and Annette Martin is a bridge to faculty postdoc at the philosophy department. So this is the way in which we are gonna organize these panelist conversations. Is the first panelist will talk around 10 minutes, it might be less, and then the panelists will answer questions. And then we will do the same with the second and the third panelists. And at the end, maybe there's still time when maybe we can have like general questions to all the panelists. So let's start with our first panelist, Aixa Alfonso. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for the invitation, Bertina and Arains, and thank you for your presentation, Dr. Rubin. So I think for me to address some of the questions you asked, you need to know a little bit about my trajectory in my field. So I grew up in Puerto Rico, and I went to the University of Puerto Rico to get a degree in biological sciences. I didn't quite know what I was going to do with that degree at the time, but in Puerto Rico, in my department, most of the faculty were women, and they were not only very good at what they did, but they actually were researchers too. And so the first thing I think it's important for me to bring to your attention is that I had images of what a professor and a researcher could be in the context of my own professors who were Puerto Rican and women, okay? And it was not until I came to the US mainland that I was told I was a minority. And so this being minoritized is something that I think is really prevalent in the US mainland. And I see this in the context of other women scientists, particularly in the College of Engineering. So I'm in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I'm really a life science researcher, but I see a lot of women coming from Europe and or Asia, where they too never question that they can do the work, because in their particular communities, they seem to be admitted and accepted as able, intelligent, good producers of information. So one of the things I wonder, Dr. Rubin, and maybe later we can deal with it, is whether this issue is unique to the US mainland and the US science production, or whether it's more widespread. Now, I was going to say that within Puerto Rican scientists, there is still the issue of both gender. So, you know, we are all Puerto Ricans. Some of us are women, some of us are men and or other identities. And there's also socioeconomic reasons why there might be separate groups, okay? But I just, from my perspective, as a Puerto Rican woman growing up in a context of a university where women actually had strong input, I didn't feel that I couldn't do something until I came to the US mainland, and I encountered several situations. First, as a graduate student, I remember being told by an individual that when we were arguing about a scientific and experimental situation, that they needed to be careful because I was Puerto Rican and I might be carrying a knife. I guess they were basing this impression on West Side Story and, you know, you're Puerto Rican, you're aggressive. The second one was that performance of some students coming from Puerto Rico, the island, to Madison, Wisconsin, which is where I did my graduate work, were thought of being less able because they spoke with a strong accent. And so, and immediately in one case, for example, they didn't do well in a test to place them in the English, you know, there's placement exams for English. And in this instance, the students didn't do well. Students reached out to me. I happened to be at the time the president of the Puerto Rican Student Association, and said, look, we grew up in New York City. We know how to speak English. I don't know why they're saying we don't. But the person in the administration to whom I spoke said, no, Puerto Ricans don't speak English very well. That's why they are not going, that's probably why they didn't do well in this exam. I'm just bringing these examples as examples of situations in which you can be put down because of the perception someone has about you and or around you. Now, I have, I think, been fortunate that along the way I have had champions that, and perhaps this is because it's also in the life sciences where there are many more women than in other disciplines, including, for example, or comparing to engineering. But I have had support along the way. I have been challenged at times in terms of trying to make a strong argument that my findings and or my positions are correct. And I have to provide perhaps extra data to support it. But I've also encountered individuals that have been very supportive of the work I do. So my graduate advisor was not very supportive, but my postdoctoral advisor was. And so I think I'm here today because of the support he gave me and the fact that he respected my work and my contribution as equal. So you talked about these tendency or the FAIR norms, and I think that we all find situations where our senior partners may not be fair. But I also think that it is expected that we'll learn to find our ways to survive. And so what I have tried to do as an advisor myself is to be aware of this unfairness and try to be more fair, that whether that is to give credit to all the people that did the work and or encourage them to put forth their ideas because they are really all worthy of sharing them. I have another reaction, and it has to do with these collaborations that you brought up. So somebody asked what agencies are supporting collaborations and whether they explicitly or just implicitly say they're good. So the National Science Foundation is actually an agency that has explicitly stated that it would be good if you have included in your project interactions with members of underrepresented groups, whether that is undergraduate students that are from historically underrepresented groups, or whether that are institutions that are recognized as places where there is a concentration of members from underrepresented groups. And the issue has been that in many cases, the minoritized and or the groups that are underrepresented feel like they are just being used. And that is, they are being named as I'm going to collaborate with this particular HBCU, for example, his historically Black university or college. And I'm going to say I'm going to work with you. But in reality, all I want to do is tell the agency that I said that I want to work with you, but I don't really take you seriously, nor do I involve you, whether it's in the creation of the project or actually in the development of the project. I just named you, okay? And so that's where that disrespect, I think, is coming in. And people are more and more aware of that. And I think more and more individuals in the underrepresented category are recognizing you cannot just use me. I need to be respected for what I do and what I provide to this. So I feel that I, again, have been fortunate in that I've had a lot of support along the way. Although I am not naive and ignorant about situations in which things could have been better and where I've had to fight, not with my fist, but with your might. So I don't know whether this is helpful for those of you in the audience, but I think that if you ask me questions, I might be better at addressing what some of the things I've said are. I also wanted to say I'm not a philosopher. I am, however, cell and developmental biologist.
So thank you. So maybe now it's time for questions.
Okay, so there's a question in the chat that says that what about funding related from non-research based projects? That I am not familiar with. And so I was speaking to research-based collaborative type of researchers of research, or research that says you're going to work with a community to address some project.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. The person who asked, maybe Santi, could give us like example of this kind of projects. Because
I love to know your first name because we only have your net ID, and so I don't know what the M stands for.
Oh, my name is Maria Enid. I'm also from Puerto Rico. And my question is more related, so I also work for UIC Campus Recreation, and is more interested in knowing if there is access any funding or grant related to promote diversity within that type of that's under student affairs. So I don't know if there's something related for that.
So Maria Need, I am not familiar with the kind of funding. Well, let me stop for a moment and think about this. As a university, so you're a UI student, or are you UI in other capacities at UIC?
I am a UIC student.
Okay, so as a UIC student, you can reach out to the, whether it's an undergraduate student or a graduate student, you can reach out to either one of those two groups, and there are funding, they have some funds that they can provide to student organizations, and I think you can put proposals to develop some collaborative project or project that involves more of the students in your realm. They also, at UIC, there are also these chancellor committees for the status of different groups. So there's a chancellor's committee for the status of Latinos. There's a chancellor's committee for the status of Blacks. There's a chancellor's Committee for the Status of LGBTQ individuals, and each one of those also have some funding that you could put forth for proposals to be supported by them. It doesn't mean you're going to be immediately get it, but that's one place. The other thing is that within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, there is a funding activity that provides up to $10,000 per term for activities that promote diversity within the college. And so that's another place where you could reach out for funding.
Thank you.
Do you have another question or? So yeah, maybe you. Yeah, Hannah. Ruben.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off if you were about
No, it's okay.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your experiences and also for mentioning that thing about the NSF. I wasn't aware that they had that initiative. And I think that your description of the sorts of reactions that people being reached out to for these sorts of things is exactly right, because I think both in the context of the modeling framework I provided, but also based on just talking to people, hearing personal experiences, the first reaction is to sort of be on board because it seems like a great opportunity. And it's only when there's more reflective thinking or more exchange of ideas between people sharing their experiences that you realize, oh, this decision that is totally rational. I mean, everyone's like getting something good out of it. And if we're thinking like, well, we're in this to have great research opportunities to do cool research, it seems totally reasonable to agree to that sort of situation. And it's only when we sort of reflect on it or think of it from a different viewpoint where you realize what's going on and you realize you ought to do something to try to change it. And I think you also asked a question about whether this is US specific or if it's broader. So I totally agree. It's going to vary country to country what sorts of categories are relevant and what sorts of norms emerge. But I don't think it's specific just to the US. I know a lot of people talk about inequalities like in the UK, various other countries, but this isn't to say that it's going to look the same everywhere you go.
Thank you. Hannah has her hand.
Yeah, I guess this is a joint question for Dr. Alfonso and Dr. Rubin, which is just, you mentioned in your experience about like the department that you sort of grew up in as in undergrad, where you had a lot of positive role models in terms of people doing research and being professors who looked like you. And I guess I was just curious how we might think about this in the model of like, can you have some sort of like, what if someone who's very prominent in the research is a member of a minority group, and does that shape the model at all? Or does it matter, like, you know, maybe they're not the majority in a department, but if there's someone who is in a position of sort of relevant prominence in a research community, does that sort of shape some of these epistemic diversity norms at all? And the collaboration partnerships that come out of it and credit and stuff.
Yeah, I guess I'll say something first. So definitely if there's differences in power, that's something that's going to interact with and can sort of cancel out or even overtake the disadvantage due to minority status. So you might think of two groups, one that's a minority and one that's much larger, which would be full professors and grad students. Full professors have a lot more power than grad students, and so the bargaining norms in those sorts of interactions are going to be a lot different than if we're thinking about just two social identity groups. Or we might think about fields where the superstars happen to be from a minority group, and even if they're not, you know, they don't have the biggest number of individuals within that community, they can sort of have influence on how bargains go. So my co-author, Kaylin O'Connor, has a paper with, I believe, Travis LaCroix, and where they talk about power by association, where if you have a group where there's a few powerful individuals within that group, they can cause their entire group to be advantaged in bargaining situations. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that can interact with minority status, and a lot of different things can come together to determine what the bargaining norms are going to look like.
Yeah, my reaction to your point, thank you, Dr. Rubin, is I am aware of examples of individuals that have reached notoriety, even though they identified as members of underrepresented groups, but because they've reached very high in the communities in which they exist, they are actually stars, as you the word you used before. They themselves then can have a lot of import on the people that they're working with, and now. And so in my field, being a Howard Hughes investigator or investigator supported by a Howard Hughes Medical Institute is a very, very, very high accolade. And I happen to know several scientists that are from underrepresented groups that have achieved that particular distinction. And yet, when you talk to them, they still are trying to overcome some of the perceptions that people have of them by just, I think, being more and more and more outstanding. So as you're building your model, what would happen if you included that as one of the variables, meaning an underrepresented person that has now gained notoriety in their particular area of expertise, as in really high notoriety?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to clarify that. So I keep saying like these models are overly simplified. This isn't included, this isn't included. Really what they're trying to do is show that there's this relationship between minority group status, discrimination, homophily, but that's always only going to be one factor that's going on in any community. There's going to be tons of other factors that if we want to talk about a particular situation, we have to include all these other factors. So just to reiterate that. But then, so if we want to look at an individual who is both sort of disadvantaged due to their association with a particular social identity group, but is advantaged due to achieving some superstar status or something like that, we have to kind of look at how that disadvantage and that advantage can interact. And there's different ways in this sort of model to encode an advantage to a particular individual. One way is that we can give them a different, what's called disagreement point. So remember I said if people both think they deserve more than half of the resource, bargaining is going to break down. Well, what happens when bargaining breaks down for different people can be different. So if I'm a superstar and I don't manage to work out this collaboration, that's not going to be so bad for me. So my disagreement point is already going to give me a pretty good payoff. Where if you're someone who's trying to collaborate with this superstar and you miss out on that collaboration, that's going to be pretty bad for you. And so your payoff is going to be worse. And so we can think about what happens when we put in different disagreement points, what happens when bargaining failure is worse for one person than another, and we can see how that affects bargaining norms as well. So that's just one way you could think about it in this sort of modeling framework. And that disagreement point, that bargaining advantage from power can overwhelm the disadvantage from being a minority.
Thank you for your answer, Professor Rubin. So now it's time to move to our second panelist, Sherry Garrett. Please, welcome.
Hi, hello everyone. Yes, my name is Cherie Garrett. I am a doctoral student in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology. And I, like Dr. Alfonso, am not a philosopher. My background is mostly in biomedical sciences. So I guess just to go over just some experiences I've had just throughout my career. I'm from Atlanta, and I would say I'm a non-traditional PhD student in that I worked in industry before coming here. Actually, two different industries. I worked in the food manufacturing industry where I managed a quality assurance lab. And I experienced some discriminatory issues in that field, mostly since I was a manager at the age of 24. So I had, I guess, two things going against me. One, that I was a woman in this particular industry, at least at the place I was at, there were a lot of men managers. Two, that I was Black. Most of them were white males. And three, that I was young. So one of the things that I had to just learn being thrown into that position was just speaking up and defending what I thought needed to be done at that job. And I think that even continues more into my research now. So when I came to UIC, one of the things that attracted me to UIC was that it was a minority serving institution. So I felt that, I would come to this university, work on my PhD, get some research done, and be around Black and brown students, So I think the minority serving institution is great that UIC has, but I think from what Dr. Rubin was speaking about earlier about effective diversity, like yes, UIC is pretty diverse, but I do feel like it does lack certain support systems to address, certain structural issues in terms of bias, implicit bias, and just dealing with hostile environments and just certain things like that, particularly in STEM, particularly from what I've known from other engineering students, they felt that way. So now as a PhD researcher, in terms of collaborations, my lab is interesting in the sense that most of the people that I work with are Chinese men. So it's not even just the gender issue as well. There's also a cultural issue, just trying to be clear in terms of things I'm saying to them and things that they're saying to me so that we can understand each other and be able to collaborate effectively in getting our papers and our research done. So I've definitely improved in those areas. And I guess just to discuss some other things, I don't know, as a PhD student, and even when I was working on my master's degree back in Atlanta, a lot of things that many of my quote unquote mentors would say were just to kind of like forget about my gender, forget about my ethnicity, and really focus on the research. And when those things are said, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been told that, but when those things are said, it just points out like this ignorance in terms of like the intersectionality of like our gender and our racial experiences. And I think that's one of the things that's very important for us to move forward in terms of reducing discrimination, increasing diversity, because I feel like a diverse environment, having this discrimination is one of the things that I believe holds us back from, being collectively creative and producing like really, really amazing products, not just biologics, but just anything or any type of research. So I think, initiatives that I've even been more involved in at UIC, I am founder and vice president of the Black Graduate Student Association. And I also sit on the Chancellor's Committee for the Status of Blacks for that committee as well. And a lot of things that we discuss, it's just like finding ways for increasing like equitable teaching practices, not just at UIC, but just in general, or even just equitable collaborations with departments and other STEM researchers and things like that. And I think all of this can, eventually it's like assess basically the inherent institutional bias that we have, which is like racism and things like that. So, so those are the main things that I think I can relate to the talk that Hannah gave, and just my general experiences, and just, really defending, I call it my science identity. Like, I've been in situations where things that I've said, like my comments have been ignored, or I've said a comment and that was ignored, but then it was said again. And it's like, well, I just said that. Or, even accusations of, is this your research, or did someone else do this for you? So it's really things of just defending what I call my science identity. So just speaking up for myself and be like, no, I did this and here's why, and here's this and here's that. It's annoying, it sucks that that's something that I have to do, but it's I feel like it's really important to show that, we're here and we can get the work done too. So and I think that's really about it. I'm not sure if anyone has any questions for me in terms of my experiences.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your experience. And now we are open to questions for.
Thank you.
I could give a reaction while people are thinking of things they want to ask. Thank you so much for commenting and for sharing your experience. So one thing I wanted to say that Shuri just pointed out is that in my talk, I went over some reasons for homophily that were really negative, right? It's like minorities running away from protecting themselves from discrimination. But there's also positive reasons for homophily. So there's positive reasons why people might like genuinely want to associate with people like them, not just because they are having bad experiences with people unlike them, but because it's a really great support system and you get information about, how to interact with people in your environment. So I don't want to suggest that leave with the impression that the only reason that people are in homophilic networks is because of discrimination in these bargaining situations. There's a whole lot of reasons why we see like very widespread in tons of different kinds of situations. We see people trying to link with other people who share aspects of their social identity. So.
Shari, if I may, I wonder whether you see or you think that having allies is important for feeling like you're recognized and that you are contributing to what you're doing, given that right now we don't have that many of us in the fields. What would you say are some of the good things that have happened as you've been developing yourself as an independent researcher?
Yeah, I think allies are incredibly important, not even just as research, but just I guess in general, because I feel like sometimes in issues as discrimination and things like that, sometimes it's exhausting when it's up to like our either our gender or our ethnicity to bring forward these issues that are happening. So it's really nice to have other allies who are like not part of this group who can really support us. So I think that's also very important. But I think in terms of allies, I also think that as you just mentioned, there's not many faces that look like me throughout most of my career and in my research. And so one of the things you might think is like, well, why do you, like, if you feel like you need this community, how do you continue? And I think it's because of the amazing women and other men that I've met who have been very, 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 very supportive. And I think mentorship is a very, very, very important thing, especially for grad students. of our Black and brown grad students. I think it's very important for us to have some sort of mentor who can be there and like and understand like the trauma that we experience as grad students, as being minority grad students, underrepresented minority grad students, and just having someone there who has your back when, especially when you're in situations that, you know, that aren't right and things like that. So I think allies are important. I want more. And so.
Thank you for your answer. Actually, Arranes has a question.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. I was wondering if you were always involved, like once you got into the PhD program, were you always involved in the UIC community and in you know, finding allies and being part of these organizations, or is that something that you kind of discovered along the process?
Right. Yeah, it's something I got involved with when I came here. Just in Atlanta, I felt fine and everything like that. But once I came here and dealt with the stress, like there's just stress of just being a PhD student in general. And then when you have experienced little things like these little microaggressions, which are things that I was experiencing, just little comments about my hair or things, or I look like some other Black woman student or things like, so just little comments like that. And I wanted a community. I wanted to be around people who like have experienced these things that I'm experiencing and how they dealt with it. That's the biggest thing, because these are my professors, and as you just said, they have power. So it's like you have to, you know, be able to have a nice conversation with them, but not also come across, which is a fear a lot of Black students have, is feeling like you're being radical, right? And so it was something that I got involved with when I came here, because like I said, my UIC is a minority serving institution, so I thought I'd see more of me, but I didn't. And so I thought it was really important to basically just build this community within UIC. I knew when I came, I was like, there are other Black graduate students. I know they're here, I just don't see them. So it's just like a visibility thing. So that's why me and another student was like, let's put this organization together so we can have a community of fellowship of all of us to get together to discuss issues that are important to us and things about the university that we might be able to, you know, stoke some change in, and just to have a group of people that have your back. So I was never really involved in any type of diversity initiatives before I came here. And I think it's just because of just the environment that we're in and how important it is. And so yeah, so it was after I came here.
Yeah, I don't know what the numbers are, but it when I came to UIC, I noticed that too, especially among the undergrad population. But there seems to be a gap maybe in the graduate population and in higher, I guess, yeah, in the graduate domain. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. It seems that we don't have more questions, but maybe we can leave it for the more general questions. So now maybe we can move on with the third panelist, is Ned Martin. So thanks for coming.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to my fellow panelists and Dr. Rubin for her talk. So I do have a handout, so I will copy the link into the chat for folks. So if you want to take a look, you can, and if I don't get to everything, you can go back to the handout. But I don't think you'll necessarily need to look at it. I think they'll probably be able to follow along easily, but you know, if you want to refer to it. Yeah, so thank you. So I'm, again, Annette Martin. I'm a postdoc in the philosophy department. And so I'm going to be drawing a lot on, you know, my experiences as a graduate student and kind of reflecting on that. And I think I'm also going to be echoing a lot of what has already been said. So I want to start off, and I think we've already kind of gotten into this, but just thinking about kind of different kinds of collaboration. Because, you know, as a philosopher, I think often, at least in kind of the Anglophone tradition, there isn't that much sort of co-authorship. And so when I, you know, first think of collaborating, that's immediately what I think of. And that's not something I actually have experience with. But when I started thinking a bit further, I realized that although I haven't co-authored, there are a number of other really important ways in which I've done a lot of collaboration with people. So I want to start off just sort of flagging some different kinds of collaboration that I think are important, for thinking about life as an academic. So, there's co-authorship, co-writing, so writing together with a group of people, collaboration in terms of mutual accountability for writing and other kinds of goals, feedback and scholarly exchange, mentorship and professional advice and support, organizing work of various kinds. So, putting together this panel, putting together, advice sessions, conferences, various kinds of organizing work, creating an intellectual community and, the other kinds of community that go along with that, hopefully, collaborating in terms of emotional support, and also establishing relationships of solidarity. So I'm sure that there are other important kinds of collaboration, but I do think that most of these represent needs that are crucial to your success. And here I'm thinking your success as an academic. And so it's important, I think, to find people and spaces that will collaborate with you in all of these different ways. At the same time, for reasons that we've been discussing, being a member of one or more marginalized groups can make it really difficult to find those people and spaces. So, I've had experiences where people seem not to think of me as their student, and so don't give me the kind of mentorship that they might give to other students, or peers who don't think of me when they think about someone that they want to exchange papers with, or a variety of other kind of experiences like that. But it's really important, right, to have people who will give you professional advice and who will exchange work with you. So it is important to find people and spaces where you can do this work. So in my experience, and I think this is very much going to echo Cherie's experience, I've often needed to create those spaces and or to get creative with where I look for these forms of collaboration and support. And so I want to flag that there is a double bind involved here, where on one hand, it takes a lot of time and energy to create and cultivate these spaces for yourself and for other people in your community. But on the other hand, if you don't put in that time and that energy, then you might miss out on these really crucial relationships and resources and inspiration that's going to make it possible for you to succeed. So I want to flag that there is a double bind here. And sometimes I wonder, is this the right advice to give? But, it's a difficult situation. Okay, so I want to talk about two examples from my graduate experience. So examples where I did some work to create these spaces where I was able to get these, valuable collaborations. And so the first is creating a co-writing group. So I ended up doing this in my 4th year. And so this was a group where we would get together once a week and write for a couple of hours. At the beginning, we would share our goals for 5 minutes, write them on the board. And then we would set a timer. So we would write for 25 minutes and then take 5-minute breaks. And so this was super important for me in my graduate experience, both for, accountability, co-writing, making sure I was actually getting my writing done, the emotional support that came out of those 5-minute breaks and establishing relationships with those people. And then also both in those breaks and further down the road, creating these peer mentorship relationships where, some of those people are people who are now on the tenure track, and I constantly go to them for advice about various things. And so those relationships have been really important for me in terms of getting mentorship and advice and support. Okay, the second example that I want to talk about is creating a minorities and philosophy or a MAP chapter in my department, and then further partnering with other MAP chapters. So in my case, I was in the New York City area. So this involved a lot of, organizing this kind of thing. So organizing advice panels, we organized 2 series of talks, we organized a 2-day conference, among various other things. And so, really, this was also really important for me in creating an intellectual community that, just in general, being a part of a community of people that took each other seriously as philosophers, which I think is really important. And that also led to opportunities for scholarly exchange. So I think largely as a result of these conferences where I met people who were working in my area and took me seriously as a philosopher, that led to establishing a social philosophy group where we, once a month or so exchange papers and give each other comment on work in progress. This was also an opportunity, for creating those relationships for peer mentorship. Also, bringing more experienced people to serve on panels like this to try to give advice. So sort of creating opportunities for ourselves to get formal mentorship, and also to pay it forward, for undergrads or other graduate students, which I think is really important as well. And it really, for me, created sort of a broader sense of community and solidarity, and allowed me to feel at home in philosophy, which I think is also really important. So yeah, I want to flag that, this took a lot of work, and it was not a smooth, easy, or quick process. I mean, both of these things happened roughly halfway into my graduate experience, and the first half was not an easy ride. But on the other hand, I did make it. So if you are in that process, you're not necessarily alone, and it's not necessarily hopeless. I think that's also hopefully a good message to hear. Okay, so lastly, I'll say a bit about kind of meta strategizing. So here I'm thinking about strategizing about how to access knowledge that you may not be able to rely on advisors or formal mentors for, or things that we're often just expected to know somehow in academia. So here I want to give a shout out to the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. So I don't know if people are familiar with that, but I know through UIC and through many other universities, you can get a free institutional membership. And I think they're an incredible resource for, a variety of topics and skills that are important to succeeding as an academic. So I think for me, they've been, just super helpful in terms of developing skills that have served me well and will continue to serve me well. So I sort of am a proselytizer for NCFDD. If you're not familiar, check them out. They might be really helpful for you. I think too, it can be really helpful to Google things. Fortunately, some people have taken the time to write blogs and articles and, general guides to being on the job market or giving comments at a conference. And often if you look for these things, you can find a lot of valuable information. And then lastly, and this is maybe in some ways sort of a call to action, I think it's also really important for departments and professional organizations to make sure to kind of develop blanket resources for people. I know in my graduate experience, there was a lot of, talk to your advisor if you want support, but sometimes your advisor is not there for you to talk to. So although it's not ideal, I think it's important to have these kind of safety nets that can, prevent people from falling through the cracks. Again, sometimes that means taking on additional labor, like organizing this conference. So again, I want to thank our organizers for doing that work. But, ideally people in less vulnerable positions with more power will take on some of that work. So that's the sense in which this is also a call to action. So yeah, happy to answer questions or discuss with all of you.
Yeah, thank you. It was really helpful. Professor Rubin?
Other people are thinking of things. I can again say something at the start. So again, yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing all this and for putting it all together. Such a nice organized handout. So I wanted to say especially thanks for putting together this list of different kinds of collaboration. So in my talk, I focused a lot on things like co-authorship. And the reason I did that was because those are the kinds of things that we have empirical results on, like we have nice measurable outcomes that can, let us do studies to observe what the patterns are. And I wanted to be able to connect this very formal abstract model to the real world in some way by connecting it to these sort of empirical observations. that I have good evidence for. I can give citations, things like that. But of course, that's not to imply that these sorts of phenomena will only happen in formal co-authorship situations. You might think the same sort of things are going on in different kinds of collaborations as well. And just sort of one connection you might think of that might not necessarily, well, I don't know how applicable it is to academia, but there's similar sorts of results that show that in non-academic workplaces, there's things like inequitable collaborations on work projects. There's things like clustering into particular domains or specialties. There's this thing in sociology called the devaluation view, where particular types of occupations are devalued when they become associated with marginalized groups. And so I think there's reasons to think, even though I don't have empirical evidence or like good citations that I can give, that this sort of phenomena is not limited just to formal collaborations, co-authorships, but it might emerge, it might crop up, it might be relevant in all these other kinds of collaborative situations that you're talking about. So thanks.
Yeah, and I think too, sort of clearly thinking about various kinds of organizing work or service work, I think that's sort of a clear case where a lot of what you're talking about is going to translate. Insofar as, yeah, you have people who need to put in varying amounts of effort into making some common thing happen.
Annette, if I may, thank you for sharing what you've done and how you've dealt with the position where you find yourself in. I'm wondering whether you would, whether you can comment on the nature of the groups that you put together, as in if, and this perhaps goes back to what I said to Sharia about allies, but it's also about like affinity groups in a sense, about what makes a good group? Do we have to, what was the term that Dr. Rubin, we all have to be the same, or can we find ways of doing this even when we might be slightly different, but we're all respectful of each other? And I don't know which one is in your case, but I know that it's important for me to find people that not only respect what I do, but that do similar things that are as interesting as the ones that I think I do. So.
Yeah, I think it's a bit different for the two examples that I gave. In that for the map chapter, I think I can say that everyone involved, even for events often that weren't like specifically for members of some marginalized group, often the people who did show up or who did participate had some identity group, part of some marginalized identity group. So that I think was a bit different from my writing group, where I mean, it was mostly women, which is, I don't know, kind of interesting. But not only women and not only people of color, not only queer folks. There was more variety there. But I think there still was, I mean, I think in that case, there was a sort of self-selection of people who were interested in writing together and to some extent, being vulnerable together in terms of, talking about what you're struggling with and seeing writing as something that could be collaborative in this way. I think there was a bit of self-selection in that respect.
Well, I have a question about in your case, because it seems that, well, maybe a bit different from the analysis that Professor Rubin did, is that in the sense that Professor Rubin is about like the outcomes of collaborations that are actually happening, but he is more about like before, like it seems that you take a stand and say, well, yeah, it seems that collaborate seems to be the best thing to do. but maybe there might be reasons for not collaborating. So it's something, so I don't know, I was wondering if you, so I think that was a good thing because there might be things that influence in that thing, like if I don't collaborate because these people are different from me, or it's because other like personal things like human psychology, like envy, like, yeah, I don't want to collaborate because I don't know, I'm so great and I don't want to share my ideas with these people, or maybe I put myself down and I don't want to show myself as being not as good philosopher as I think. So I think, I don't know, it's important, like, I don't know, like the question about what will be the motivations to get into collaboration and like try to see what the benefits are in doing that. So I think that was a good thing to bring.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and in part because I think it's kind of complicated, because on one hand, part of the motivation, especially in the case of the map chapter, was the kind of discriminatory effects, right, that Professor Rubin was talking about, of I'm not getting mentorship, I'm not getting scholarly exchange, I'm not getting a supportive intellectual community, but I need these things. So where can I go? How can I make sure that I'm getting those things? So in that sense, I mean, yeah, to some extent, I think that also points in the direction of homophily, which we've been talking about. On the other hand, it is a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, again, thinking about, you know, the writing group, that's not exactly the same kind of situation. But I do think with respect to the map chapter, I mean, again, like the people who were coming to these conferences, coming to these talk series, coming to these panels, in most cases were other women, people of color, queer folks, etc. I mean, in that respect, like the sort of intersectional aspect of it did allow for a certain kind of diversity, you know, where there was this sort of coalition effect. Yeah, so I don't know, I think it's complicated.
Yeah, thank you. So I think now, given the I will, they.
Yeah, so this has been really interesting to me in a bunch of different ways. I got to engage with Professor Rubin as a philosopher of science, and now I'm kind of been moved more to think about myself as chair of the philosophy department, and someone who's actually been teaching for a long time. And it's really interesting to kind of hear the kinds of things you're saying, and also like the with Annette, it's a little easier because she wrote it down so I can actually look at it and overcome my fading memory. But it's what's interesting is you have experiences in virtue of your various identities, and they cause problems. But the kinds of solutions that are being proposed are the kinds of things that would work for anyone. Right. So if I go down the list of things, I mean, you have to tweak it because some of them are directly tied to identities, but almost all the things on Annette's list are things I would recommend to any graduate student in philosophy as helpful things to do. And I think this came up both with Cherie and Aixa's points as well. And so I don't know quite how to think about this, but it's almost as if the kinds of resources we should be giving to everyone are even more important for people who are in the kind of underrepresented group and struggling with various kinds of discriminatory practices. And I don't know if that comment feels right to you, or whether you think I've kind of missed the point in some important way.
So I think that that's largely right. So especially, you know, the point I was trying to make at the end about these kind of formal mentorship, formal advice opportunities. Yeah, I think that's something that all students can benefit from, or sort of all people at whatever stage of their career can benefit from. But I do think they can be particularly important for people who, you know, might not otherwise get that advice or that support. And then, yeah, just thinking about the kinds of collaboration that I was thinking about, and, you know, something like a writing group. I think it's absolutely right that these are things that, you know, we all need if we're going to be successful. And then there are just sort of particular challenges that come with getting those things depending on various features of your identity.
Yeah, and I agree. I think like mentorship is also very important, mostly also because of for retention. You know, I know one of the issues that USC's been dealing with is Black student retention, particularly on the undergraduate side. And, you know, a lot of us feel that, you know, having proper mentorship is important because it'll keep those students more engaged and feeling more safe. And they'd be more likely to, you know, to stay in the UIC community or whatever college or university for that matter. And I also think it's the same even on a graduate level, it's just having those mentorships will help with things like retention and increasing even potentially, you know, Black and brown faces in these fields and in these departments. And also I think funding, of course, there's funding inequalities too as well. So I think we mentioned that earlier with the NSF stuff. You know, having those resources available for students will probably likely, you know, keep more of them around. And once you have that visibility, more students will see that and they'll be more likely to, you know, continue on with their education in a field that is, you know, may not predominantly be, you know, of their ethnicity. So I think all those things are important. So I agree.
So Dave, my reaction to your point is that it is true that everybody can benefit by having access to what we've talked about today. But I also think it's just as important to be respected. And the problem is that sometimes because of the way you look, or because of where you came from, or because of the way you speak, you are immediately thought of as less than. And so if that is the case, then already there's a barrier there, because then you think that you have to overcome even more. And so one of the things, Cherie, you may or may not be aware of this, but at UIC, we now have a big project that is to try to make sure that students that identify as Latinx or African American, or that come from low income and therefore are first in their families to go to college, do not need to leave behind their identities to become also a scientist. It's like you can be both. You can be all of the things you are, and you don't need to walk into the door of a lab and strip yourself of who you are to be someone else inside the lab. And so I think if we can get our community, our science or academic or higher education communities, just to recognize that we all have assets and that we have things to contribute. And I don't want to be naive, but I think that's what we need. We need to go there as a whole. I got off my soapbox there.
So maybe we have, maybe actually we are like at the end of the time we're planning, but maybe, I don't know, if you have, any of you have a general question for the panelists or of the speaker, maybe it's the moment. Yeah, so, well, or maybe you need more time to think about questions. So I will leave the email of the panelists and the speaker in case you want to ask them something. So yeah, I think it might be clear who belongs to the emails. And so now, so we hope you enjoy your talk with our speakers and the conversation with the panelists. Our next workshop will take place on April 16, and the topic will be mentoring relationships. So actually, some of these discussions that have deal with this issue. So in that sense, we're continue discussing this. And we will send a recording of this workshop and information about the incoming workshop by email. So hope you come to the next workshop, and please send us feedback to know how we make the workshops better. And thanks for coming today. And have a good evening.
Thank you to the panelists for showing up and talking with us for an hour. And thank you so much to the organizers for putting this together. It was really great.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. Yeah, this is great. I had so much fun and I learned a lot.